And welcome to the Hail Mary, the GPP podcast. I'm Big Italy 42 here, reading Scott Mailwig's article at Sports 25 to Life, highlighting some of his favorite GPP plays. So I'm here to read them for you and let you know who he's looking at. Starting off at the top with Peyton Manning for the Broncos, facing off against the Ravens, one of the higher game totals and team totals, I should say, for the week. And Manning's the guy who no one seems to be talking about, other than talking about how he potentially has a dead arm. But that's a narrative that we've been hearing for a few years now, really. So Scott here is a believer that he could certainly end up paying off his salary and be a guy that flies under the radar quite a bit this week. And I tend to agree. You got guys like Haloti Ngata no longer on this defensive line. This isn't the defense that we have seen before, but I mean, you still got guys like Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, C.J. Anderson, especially as involved as he is in the passing game. Even without a strong arm, you get these wide receiver screens for Demaryius Thomas, things of that nature. Certainly a big upside for Peyton Manning, even if he doesn't have success with the deep ball. So I'm on board with that call. I think that's a great call that, it's an elite player, one of the best that we've seen in our generation. And while he's not quite the player that he once was, certainly a guy that no one seems to be talking about despite his tons of options on offense. Another option here, Adrian Peterson. And obviously he's a guy who, by name recognition alone, will probably be fairly high owned. But Scott loves him as his favorite GPP play at running back position. And, this is a guy that, as you're looking at it, he's facing off against the 49ers. And while that's a perceived tough matchup, this is a shredded defense from what they once were. Got some guys gone due to like Aldon Smith leaving, Justin Smith retiring, things like that. Lots of guys missing. This is no longer an elite defensive unit, and it quite possibly could be a bad one. And Adrian Peterson, despite the fact that this is a bad offensive line and for the Vikings, he's one of the most talented players at any position in the NFL, and you got to anticipate he's going to try to come back with a vengeance after missing, a lot of last season there with that suspension. So Adrian Peterson, definitely a guy with some huge upside here. Next up, Doug Martin. If you've been around DFS or you've been around fantasy or even the NFL for a few years, you remember Doug Martin a few years ago having his breakout season, called the Muscle Hamster, a nickname that he hates. But this is a guy that's very cheap, especially on DraftKings this week. And he does have some big-time upside. And he should be getting a high volume of carries against a Tennessee team that was one of the worst rushing defenses in all of football last year. Doug Martin, obviously, Jameis Winston under center. Rookie quarterback, a guy that could see a ton of volume. So I like that call. As a cheap guy, I mean, he's a low-risk, high-reward type of play there. So that's a great call on his end. Again, A.J. Green, he mentioned how this is a guy who is under-owned seemingly every week. He's not Julio Jones or Dez Bryant, as Scott says, but he's awfully close. This guy's had two monster Week 1 performances each of the last two seasons. And Andy Dalton, obviously, the thorn in the side of A.J. Green owners. A.J. Green obviously dealt with some injuries last year as well, but it's an Oakland secondary that's bad. Not very good at all. One of the worst in all of football, actually. And, he is head and shoulders the top option as far as receiving core for Cincinnati. So A.J. Green, certainly a guy with big-time upside. And even when Andy Dalton isn't completely accurate or isn't having a great game, A.J. Green can certainly bail him out, as we've seen many, many times. So that's a great call there. Definitely get yourself some shares of A.J. Green where everyone's looking at all these other elite names. An interesting one here that not a lot of people are talking about, but this guy was a beast in college. We saw some great moves, some great plays from him in the preseason as well. Amari Cooper for the Raiders. This is a Raiders attack that no one's talking about. And, Carr had actually a pretty good season last year considering he had a lack of weapons. And they didn't have a whole lot of rhythm last season, as Scott points out, but they also didn't have an Amari Cooper to catch passes. So his price a little bit higher than you'd like it to be, but Derek Carr certainly has big playability. I mean, this is a guy who was a volume passer in college, and this is a team that Scott mentions here threw 55 times in one preseason game. They're pretty big underdogs, so that right there tells you they're going to be throwing the ball. They're going to be playing from behind, and Amari Cooper is an elite talent as far as rookies go, moving into the NFL here. So he's a guy certainly want to keep on your radar. Going to be very low owned this week. Then the Owen Daniels play for the Broncos. If you know anything about Peyton Manning or his offenses, you know that he loves his tight ends. Gary Kubiak loves his tight ends. Everyone loves their tight ends there. And he relies on them a lot. Obviously, you've got Julius Thomas out of town now. He's in Jacksonville. He's not even playing. He's injured right now. But Delaney Walker, Larry Donnell, particularly, guys similarly priced, as Scott points out here, that are going to take away some ownership from Owen Daniels. But we know the kind of red zone targets these guys. I mean, Julius Thomas was an unknown until Peyton Manning turned him into a stud with some elite numbers there. So this is a guy that, you're going to be worried on defense about Emmanuel Sanders and about C.J. Anderson, about Demaryius Thomas, and then enter Owen Daniels into that. And he's a guy who's going to see a lot of snaps because, as Scott points out here, he is a great blocker. And there's not going to be anyone keying on Owen Daniels in this offense because he's about the fourth option there. So in a potent offensive attack, fourth option still a pretty good GPP target there. So he likes that. And then the Bengals defense facing the Raiders. And this is a Raiders team that's going to air it out. And this is a Bengals defense that has a pretty good defense. Obviously, the defensive line healthy now. Geno Atkins, the return of Michael Johnson. And this is not an elite unit, but they're also a unit who has been elite when healthy. And, we're expecting the Raiders to be behind and throwing the ball quite a bit. And that just opens up opportunities for interceptions, turnovers, things of that nature. And you got to expect that the Bengals defense can make some plays, get some sacks on this quarterback, and make some plays in the secondary as well. So check out all of the rest of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com. I'm Big Italy 42. We are on Twitter at DFCafe. Go ahead and subscribe to this YouTube channel too. We cover all the sports. Lots of great content to help you win at DFS at dailyfantasycafe.com.